Yeah.
Yeah.
Agora já estamos ao vivo.
Estamos ao vivo. Boa tarde a todas e a todos. Nós vamos dar prosseguimento ao primeiro encontro virtual de grupos de pesquisa e laboratórios de história ambiental, agora com a nossa última atividade, e contamos com a presença do professor John McNeill, e estamos muito felizes com isso. A palestra será em inglês, e trabalharemos para que o vídeo seja legendado depois, quando for ficar no YouTube. Na hora das perguntas e respostas, faremos a tradução, tanto das perguntas como das respostas. E agora eu passo a palavra para a minha colega Natasha Otoya, fazer uma introdução do professor John McNeill, e vamos começar a palestra. Natasha, a palavra é sua, muito obrigado.
Obrigada, Gabriel. Obrigada a todo mundo que está aqui assistindo a gente. Sejam todas e todos bem-vindos. O professor John McNeill, ele é historiador ambiental e dá aulas na Universidade de Georgetown, nos Estados Unidos, em Washington, na capital. Desde 1985, ele dá aula na Escola de Serviços, Relações Internacionais e também no Departamento de História. Ele tem o doutorado pela Duke University e já recebeu muitos prêmios, Fulbright, Guggenheim, MacArthur, Toynbee. O último foi o Heineken, o Prêmio Heineken de História, em 2018. Ele também já foi presidente da Associação Americana de História Ambiental entre 2011 e 2013. Depois, ano passado, ele serviu como presidente da AHA, a Associação Americana de História. Ele escreveu no ano 2000 a obra Something New Under the Sun, Algo Novo sobre o Sol, e é um livro que é considerado um marco da disciplina e traz um panorama sobre a ação humana no planeta ao longo do século XX. Trata de diversas esferas da atuação humana. O livro faz reflexões sobre a atmosfera, a litosfera, a hidrosfera, o uso da energia, o aumento do uso da energia da energia fóssil e da pressão demográfica ao longo do século XX. Terminamos o século com 7 bilhões de pessoas na Terra. Hoje a gente vai escutar as reflexões do professor McNeill sobre as últimas 2 décadas, desde o lançamento do livro no ano 2000. Então, são as últimas 2 décadas de produção do campo que esse livro ajudou a consolidar. A gente está muito feliz com a presença dele aqui. Vou passar a palavra. Professor McNeill, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natasha, for those kind words. At least I think they were kind words. And thanks to all my friends in Brazil, old friends and new friends, for the invitation and the opportunity to speak with you today on the subject of a book that I wrote 20 years ago. And I apologize for speaking to you in English, but as my old friends in Brazil know, I can't speak Portuguese, so this is the only way I can do it. I'm going to share my screen with you now. And I hope that you can see that properly. Lizzie, can you see that properly?
I can, but I'm actually seeing the one that has the next slide with it. We are not seeing the presentation. We are seeing your screen, the screen that of the presenter.
Let me try. Oops, just a moment. I'm going to have to share a different screen with you.
Not a problem. I like to know what's coming next.
Yeah, but I've got to find out how to make this big again. Excuse me for the technical difficulties. Just a second, I'll figure this out eventually. Huh. Oh, let me stop sharing and I'll start again.
Desculpa. Liz e Pada, vocês querem falar alguma coisa nessa apresentação também? Desculpa.
Não, tô no final.
Tudo bem.
Well, maybe I can just, while John is finding out the right screen, let me just tell you that this book got the award as the best book in history, in global history. I think it was 2000, if I'm not wrong.
That's correct.
And it was a very interesting point because it was a moment when the field of global history was just finding a second breath or third breath, I don't know. But it was a moment the field was considered a bit the secondary field or something. And the end of the century, beginning of the new century was when the global history just got to the importance it has today. And I think that John's book was quite important to give this kind of environmental approach to this new reformulation of the field. I remember because I was a grad student and I was invited to comment on John's book. And later on, he complained that I proposed to mutilate his book because I was saying that the different chapters could be interchangeable. So it was in the HA of San Francisco. It was really a watershed book. I mean, something that really changes the way we think about the 20th century. If I'm not wrong, it was part of a collection on books on the 20th century.
That's correct. One of planned 13 books in a series, of which only 2 were ever actually published. Dang it. Okay. All right, let me try again.
Go ahead. Gorgeous, that's it.
Yes,
Perfect.
that's working now. Mhm.
Okay, and we'll see if I can. Okay, so this is actually the second slide. Here's the first slide. Sorry about all the technical difficulties and my incompetence. You would think I would know by now how to manage Zoom, but I have my limits as a Zoom lecturer. So again, thanks to everybody for inviting me to join and to conclude the Encontro Virtual de Grupos de Pesquisa e Laboratórios de História Ambiental do Brasil. Now you can see why I'm doing it in English instead of in Portuguese. So you can see here the plan of today's talk. I'm going to explain first what this book, Something New Under the Sun, said in terms of its main arguments. Then I'm going to explain what I wish I had done differently in that book. And then I'll say a little bit about some of the trends of the last 20 years in the global environment. Much of this will probably be familiar to you, but maybe not. And then I'll say a little bit about trends in environmental history since the year 2000, confining myself to the Anglophone literature, which is what I know best. So that's my plan, and I hope to take less than 30 minutes. And after that, we can discuss whatever you might want to discuss. So, the book, as Lizzie said, was part of a series. It was supposed to be a general history of the 20th century, of which only the economic history and the environmental history were ever published. I was asked to do this in the early 1990s, and I began seriously to think about it around 1993. I wrote it between 1996 and 1998, and it was first published 20 years ago in the year 2000. Here are the main arguments of the book. First and foremost, that the 20th century, and especially the second half of the 20th century, after 1950, was a unique time in environmental history, a unique time in the history of the Earth. It was, so to speak, something new under the sun. And what it was could not continue indefinitely. It was radically unsustainable. The reason I thought the 20th century, and particularly the post-1950 period, was unique and different from anything that the Earth had ever seen before was not so much because of new environmental processes, but mainly because old ones had grown so much in scale and scope, had become much more intensified. Now, I admit there were some new environmental processes, such as the thinning of the ozone layer, which did not happen before the 20th century. It didn't really happen before the second half of the 20th century. But for the most part, it was old things intensifying to new levels that made the 20th century something new under the sun. I also argued in that book that eventually the environmental history of the 20th century is going to appear as the most important thing about the 20th century. More important than the great political events of the world wars or the Cold War. More important than, as I called it, the growing emancipation of women. More important than anything else. It may not seem so yet, but it will one day seem so. I still believe that. And I also argued that the main reasons why the 20th century, and particularly the second half of the 20th century, had this bizarre, anomalous, unprecedented quality was first and foremost the energy system that was based on fossil fuels and became so widespread in the 20th century. And that gave many parts of the world cheap and abundant energy with which all sorts of activities could be undertaken, from accelerated deforestation, accelerated mining, whaling. All these things required cheap and abundant energy. And the kind of cheap and abundant energy, fossil fuels, coal and oil, was a particularly consequential choice because it's so pollution intensive and carbon intensive. So that, I argued, was the main reason why the 20th century's environmental history was as turbulent as it was. But I also argued that population growth and urbanization had something to do with it, that the pressures of the international system driving states to build up their military machines and sometimes use them also had something to do with it, that the specific technologies developed in the 20th century had something to do with it. Many of them were pollution-intensive technologies built to work with the energy system that was being built at the same time. And I also argued that the big ideas of the 20th century were conducive to environmental turbulence. By big ideas, I meant the overarching ideas that shaped the behavior of millions of people and institutions and governments. So among those ideas, I explored nationalism, communism, and what I call the growth fetish that was common to capitalism and communism. I didn't actually consider capitalism itself as an idea. I think it's actually different from nationalism and communism in this respect. Nationalism and communism existed in people's minds before they existed as socio-political systems. Capitalism existed as a socio-political system before it existed in people's minds. So I didn't treat it independently as an idea. Some people thought that was a big mistake on my part, including my friend Donald Worcester. So what do I wish I had done differently? So I've divided this into two categories, the selfish wishes and the less selfish wishes. Selfishly, I wish I'd found a Portuguese language publisher. I found a Spanish language publisher, but not a Portuguese language publisher. So I regret that, but oh well. I also selfishly wish that I had come up with a good name for the environmental turbulence of the 20th century, especially the post-1950 period. If I had come up with a name like the Anthropocene, that would have been a great idea. Or the Great Acceleration, which I did help to come up with that name, but only several years later. And one of the things I've learned is that as a scholar, it really helps to come up with a catchy name for your ideas. And I did not do that. Less selfishly, here are some things that I wish I had done differently. First of all, I didn't say much about the destabilization of climate. What I did say was that global average temperatures had increased slightly and that this might be a dominant theme of the 21st century, but it wasn't a dominant theme, wasn't even an important theme in the 20th century. And while I think that is correct, I still think it was the wrong thing to do. Because I knew, as many people knew in the late 1990s, that climate change, climate destabilization was proceeding rapidly. And I didn't give it the importance that I should have given it. So more detail on greenhouse gases and climate destabilization. I should have done that. Secondly, while I did write a lot about microbes and pathogens and changes in the relationship between society and human disease, I didn't give much attention to emerging diseases. And now, particularly in this year of the COVID-19 pandemic, it seems a mistake not to have paid more attention to that. And lastly, in the late 1990s, like a lot of other people, I recognized that the Chinese economy was growing fast. China was reasserting itself as the world power. China was beginning to exercise a gigantic influence over global environmental history. It wasn't difficult to see that when I was finishing this book, but I did not make that a theme. I did not fully explore that, and I wish I had. So those are some things that I wish I had done differently in the book. But most of the arguments in it, I still believe. I'm going to transition now and talk about some of the trends since 2000. And you can help me in the Q&A by bringing to my attention things that I'm not talking about here. The reason that will be especially helpful to me is that my American publisher wants me to produce a new edition of this book. So I need to find some things to say. And most of those things will be about what has changed in the last 20 years. And my argument to my publisher was that, in fact, very little has changed. The trends continue in place. And the editor at the publishing house said, that's not good enough. You need to come up with a better set of claims. I'm not sure that I should. I think perhaps I should insist that the truth is the truth. So here's the first aspect of global environmental history since 2000 that I want to stress. And this is directly related to my first regret, what I didn't stress in the book itself, and that's the big macro trends in atmospheric chemistry and in global average temperatures. And you've seen data like this before, I'm sure. I just want to underscore a couple of things. One, on the map is the geography of warming and how concentrated it is at the Arctic latitudes and in the arid regions of the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean. So far, it could change, but the warming is remarkably unevenly distributed. And the global climate models suggest that will continue to be the case. And then the second thing I really want to emphasize is here in the carbon dioxide concentration measurements taken from a mountaintop in Hawaii, and how steady and relentless this curve is. The wiggles in the curve are seasonal. What they reflect is the amount of carbon absorbed into plant matter in the northern hemisphere, which has more plant matter in it than the southern hemisphere. So there is an annual fluctuation. But aside from that, the trend is steady and relentless. And you can't even see things like the global economic recession of 2008. It just don't register. It is relentless. So in that respect, there's nothing new under the sun in the early 21st century. I'm impressed by the relentlessness, the insensitivity of this curve to things that seem important to human beings. Okay. Energy and population. So In the book, I argued that energy is, the energy system created and built out in the 20th century was the single most important variable governing macro scale global environmental history. I still think that is true. The trends since the year 2000 are, not surprisingly, very much like the trends in carbon dioxide concentrations and the trend in climate, which is more of the same, continuation of the overall direction of the curve of energy consumption. And within each band, these are energy sources here, there is some variation. You know, coal, for example, seems to have leveled off as of about 5 years ago. And some of the renewables have expanded their share, but it's still tiny. And the home truth is an unpleasant truth about oneself. The home truth is that there are no big changes in the energy system. And it still drives, more than anything else, the environmental history that we have on Earth. Now, I also argued that the population growth was an important variable, a secondary variable, but an important one. And here, one trend is secure and in place, and that is the falling rate of growth, which has been falling since the 1960s, with some bumps and wiggles along the way. But in the last 30 years, since 1990, it's been fairly consistent in its decline. And every indication is it will continue to decline. From the point of view of global environmental stability, that's a good thing. It might be a better thing if that decline were faster, but it's pretty steady in its rate over the last 30 years. I do want to point out, however, that the geography of growth is changing over the last 20 years in interesting ways. And Africa is very shortly going to overtake Asia as the locus of most of the population growth in the world. It hasn't happened yet, but it has been since 1990 or so. Africa has been increasing its contribution to global population rapidly. Asia's annual increase has been declining rapidly. Most of the rest of the world rather steady and insignificant. So there is a big change in the works over the last 30 years in the distribution of population growth. I also argued in the book that the tensions of the international system were a major contributor to the environmental turbulence of the 20th century. Partly that was an outcome of war and preparation for war, both large-scale conflicts like World War I and World War II, and conflicts that consisted of sub-conflicts like the Cold War, with its insurgencies and low-level civil wars in many parts of the world. But it was also a matter of preparation and not warfare itself, not combat. The large-scale commitments in all of the major economies I think that's accurate to say, to military production. And the fact that in all the major economies, military establishments were either exempt or almost exempt from environmental regulations, given a carte blanche to pollute and to modify environments, all in the interest of national security. There are other respects in which the international tensions were powerful. My favorite example is the creation of the interstate highway system in the United States, which was environmentally consequential. It was created in large part, not exclusively, but in large part for reasons of military preparedness in the 1950s and 1960s. It was a Cold War project. So what has happened since 2000? Initially, there's the marked reduction in international tensions in the 1990s, and it extended into the very beginning of the 21st century, but it did not last. I have some figures in this chart here. These are approximate figures. They're put together by the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research, I think it's called, SIPRI. But nobody really knows about levels of military spending in some countries. China is particularly opaque, but the United States is not all that transparent in military spending either. But the trend since the early 2000s, particularly since the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003, mainly a remilitarization in terms of expenditure. And I think, I haven't studied this, but I think that translates into a resurgence of the role of the military in shaping environmental outcomes and environmental history. Military establishments are still heavy users of fossil fuels. They are still almost exempt from environmental regulation, rules against pollution. So I think it's accurate to say that after a relaxation of international tensions, those tensions have rebounded, not to the same extent that they characterized the world between 1914 and 1989, but they have still rebounded. And with that, the responsibility for environmental turbulence that belongs to militaries has also rebounded. And as I note here, approximately 38% of global military expenditure is undertaken by the USA alone. That number is falling, but it's still remarkable. Now, as I said, amongst my regrets is that I didn't pay proper attention to the rise of China in the book. That rise of China is only more evident in the early 21st century. And that's visible, for example, in the carbon emissions. China, now, mind you, there are many different ways to measure carbon emissions, but by most measures, China 6-8 years ago overtook the United States as the largest carbon emitting country, and that gap between China and the United States has grown every year. China's overall proportion of global emissions continues to grow every year. And there are some amazing data about cement production, for example. And China's contribution is now greater than that of all the rest of the world combined. It has been since about 2007 or 2008. So China early in the 21st century seems to be having a environmentally disruptive effect that is perhaps analogous to the environmentally disruptive effect that the United States had in the 20th century. Now, I don't know what the rest of the century is going to look like. I'm not making this as a prediction for the entire 21st century. I'm only saying that for the first 2 decades, it looks as if that might come to pass. And China has become, I think it's fair to say, the key player in international climate politics. Decisions made in Beijing are the most influential decisions about what happens to the emissions and global climate. Ideas. Now, in the book, as I said a few minutes ago, I argued that big ideas had a considerable impact on shaping the 20th century's environmental history. And I mentioned nationalism, communism, and the growth fetish. What I didn't mention was religions. And I examined that in the book, and I concluded that religions don't seem to have much of an impact. Many people disagree with me about that. I still think it's essentially true. My conclusion, actually, I have quoted for you here. The overarching priority of economic growth was easily the most important idea of the 20th century for the environment. So what has happened in the last 20 years? Well, almost nothing. Unless you consider China to still be communist, communism has disappeared as an idea, but it doesn't make much of a difference. I mean, there's less of that peculiar environment characteristic of, say, East Germany or Poland or Ukraine in the late 20th century with its heavy industrial pollution. There's that kind of environment is no longer as widespread as it was before 1989. But nonetheless, there are no real shifts in the way that ideas affect the environment, mainly because the growth fetish is still intact. Well, that's the way I see it. Now, environmental ideas, I argued in the book that environmental ideas had grown tremendously in their popularity, but that they had not grown much in terms of their impact on the environment. And I still think that's substantially true. Environmental ideas have changed somewhat in the last 20 years. I would say the biggest change is that anxiety about climate change has eclipsed all other environmental concerns, globally speaking. That's not true in every location. And I would say that there's some modest ups and downs in the degree to which environmental thinking is popular and persuasive in various societies. But I don't think there are any big changes in the way that environmental ideas affect the environment. And I still don't think that environmental ideas do affect the environment all that much. Here, I'm impressed with the power of inertia, as I am with respect to the energy system and with respect to the growth fetish. Okay, technologies. I argued in the book that technologies, the kinds of technologies that were created in the 20th century, many of which were designed to work with the energy system of fossil fuels, that these technologies are also important in giving us the kind of environmental history that we got in the 20th century. And I also argued that in the future, technologies were going to have a different impact because they would be selected partly for having low environmental impact. Whereas in the most of the 20th century, technologies, the process by which technologies were invented and became widespread, it didn't matter if they were environmentally disruptive or not. That was not part of the selection criteria. But it has become part of the selection criteria. So the impact of technology and changes in technology, I think, is different in the 21st century than it was in most of the 20th century. And I think this is evident in the most important sector of technology, which is energy technology. So here, you can see some fairly recent data about the growth of renewables since 2004. And that's roughly a six-fold increase. There have been, as you're probably aware, considerable reductions in the price of electric power generated by renewables. And in that lies, in my view, a great deal of hope for fundamental changes in the energy system. Because I think that to get real change in the energy system, it is not going to come from policy so much as it's going to come from market realities. Now, so far, that hasn't made all that much difference in the global energy mix. Fossil fuels in the late 20th century accounted for 75 to 80% of the world's energy system. And today, they account for 75 to 80% of the world's energy system. But a potential turning point has already occurred, and that is that solar power and wind power are, if you take subsidies out of the equation, are now cheaper than fossil fuel generated electricity. And that could be the beginning of a big change. I hope it is, and I think it is. It won't be fast, but it will be big. So I regard that as a key variable for the environmental history of the 21st century. Now, I want to bring to your attention one other thing. I apologize, this slide is a bit fuzzy. I just grabbed it from an article published 2 days ago in Nature. So some Israeli scientists have tried to measure the growth of what they call anthropogenic mass. That is the mass of everything that humans make against biomass, plants, animals, etc. And their conclusion, you can see in this graph. First of all, you see that, and it should come as no surprise, I hope, that in the second half of the 20th century, the anthropogenic mass just exploded. And then they say that right around 2020, give or take 6 years, the anthropogenic mass exceeded global biomass for the first time. Now, there are all sorts of methodological quibbles, but it's an interesting way to think about the human impact on the Earth, an interesting way to assess the validity of the Anthropocene idea. So I recommend this article to you if you've got a few minutes. This graphic here also comes from the article. And you can see that the total mass of plastic now exceeds the total mass of animals by a ratio 2 to 1, which seems particularly surprising and meaningful to me. So that is an interesting new trend. I'm going to conclude here with my assessment of trends in the scholarly arena of environmental history, confining myself to the Anglophone component of that. And I want to stress that these are merely my impressions off the top of my head. I haven't undertaken any literature surveys. I used to do that from time to time and write historiographical articles about global environmental history, but I haven't done that since 2010, and I don't intend to do it again, mainly because it's so much work to read all that stuff. So here are my impressions. Impression number one, that the methods in use in environmental history are shifting and becoming more involved with the natural sciences, and often through collaboration with natural scientists. Now, this could be just me. I've been working more and more like this myself, and maybe that makes me more aware of other people working like this. And so it could be observer bias, but I think this is one of the trends. With respect to the subject matter that environmental historians in the English-speaking world are interested in, I think you can see some shifts, some things becoming more prominent, such as attention to climate history, animal history, urban environmental history, the environmental history of war. None of these things are new, but I think they're getting more attention in the last 20 years than they did in the previous 30 years. And at the same time, other subjects are declining in their prominence. And some of the ones that seem to me to be declining include national parks, wilderness, particularly North American fascination in environmental history. Almost nobody pays attention to that anymore. Famous, iconic nature writers, they're not nearly as popular as a subject of scholarly work as they used to be. Industrial pollution seems to be less interesting to environmental historians in the English-speaking world than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Again, just my impressions. Some broad trends now. I see what I'm calling here an international turn. Some people use the word global turn. I don't think that's right. And the reason is, what I think environmental historians in the English-speaking world are doing is paying more attention to countries other than their own. But that's not the same as a global term, because they're not operating on a global scale, or very few of us choose to operate on a global scale. And there are lots of good reasons not to operate on a global scale as a scholar. But I think there's a strong international turn. I think you can see this in the pages of the two major English language journals in environmental history. And you can see that at long last, there is high quality environmental history work that deals with the Middle East, the Arab world, with Russia, with Southeast Asia, which was almost non-existent 20 years ago. So that's one broad trend. Second one, in the 1990s, we saw what we call in English a cultural turn in history generally and in environmental history very visibly. That, I think, is diminishing now, and it is giving ground to what is sometimes called neo-materialism. That is a perspective that distributes agency to non-human things. That could be animals, but it could even be, in the work of some neo-materialist scholars, it could be things, metals, minerals. This is, to my way of thinking, something of a resurgence of environmental determinism within environmental history. I think it's slow, but I think it's visible. Third broad trend, professionalization, or what we sometimes call mainstreaming of environmental history. So in the early decades in North America and in Britain, it would be true in Australia, New Zealand, Canada as well, environmental history was substantially affected by, if not dominated by, scholars whose political commitments drove their work. They were environmental historians because they were environmentalists. That is less and less true. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just making that observation. So environmental history has become more professionalized in the sense that the scholars doing it are more professional historians first, rather than anything else. And at the same time, and connected to that, environmental history has become more mainstream within the discipline of history, for better or for worse. Broad trend number 4, and this is my final point. There has been, I'm pretty sure, a gradual increase in the proportion of environmental history work done by women. When I first started going to the environmental history meetings in North America, Carolyn Merchant and Susan Flatter were the only women in the room, typically. But that's no longer the case, especially amongst the rising generation of younger scholars. The proportion of women has grown very considerably. I think if you made a study of the authorship of the articles published and books published, you'd find the same thing. I haven't made that study. I can't be absolutely sure, but I'm pretty sure that that's going on. At the same time, I do not see any visible trend towards diversity as on other measures besides gender. So in terms of authorship, and that's something that is pretty conspicuous in environmental history in the Anglophone world, not only the United States, it's true in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Britain as well. What I've got as an image here does not speak to environmental history, but I thought you might find it interesting. I was hunting for data about, I only did this morning. This is not a research project of mine. I was just trying to see if I could find something to substantiate my impressions here. And I didn't, but I did find this, which is about natural sciences and social sciences and the gender ratio of authorship in various countries around the world. And I see that Russia and Argentina seem to be the most equal of all countries in the world. Portugal not too terribly far behind. I don't know where Brazil stands, but I think when it comes to the Anglophone world represented here by the US, the UK, and Australia, maybe you count India too, as far as scholarly production is concerned. India is really an Anglophone country. The proportion in environmental history is probably about the same as the proportion across these natural and social sciences that were studied by this set of authors here. I don't know for sure. That's just my best guess. So those are some of the trends that I see in the Anglophone environmental history scholarship since Something New Under the Sun was published. And I'm not contributing to the improvement of diversity because as a male and a white guy, I intend to continue writing. So I'm going to make myself part of the problem. Okay, this is it. Thank you very much for your attention. My overall conclusion is that things have continued on the trajectories that were established in the late 20th century without fundamental change. Here's when my book was published in 2000, had absolutely no impact whatsoever on anything, least of all the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. So aside from the hopeful trend in renewable energy technology and the price of renewable energy, I think the key conclusion, the takeaway message is that the trends established in the 20th century, especially the late 20th century, have characterized the early 21st century with remarkable tenacity and remarkable inertia. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. Natasha, are you there?
Hi, I'm back. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm having technical problems. Okay. So thank you so much, Professor, for your...
As we all...
Can everybody hear me? Am I back? Yes, okay.
Yes.
So before we read questions from our YouTube viewers, I'd like to get the impressions from Lizzie and Padua, Professor Cedrez and Professor Padua, about your reflections on the book. Thank you so much it's always a wonderful opportunity to hear you talk about environmental history and your work. So yes. Lizzie?
Natasha, should I speak in English or Portuguese?
Yes, I think you can speak English, and then I can translate part of what Professor McNeill says. I'm going to translate his answers rather than all of the stuff, right? Eu vou traduzir apenas as respostas do Professor McNeill.
Okay. John, it was again an amazing talk. I always impressed with your grasp of very tough subjects in a way that upon your audience. I do have a couple of comments too. It is very depressing to realize that the growth of environmentalism has very little impact in carbon dioxide or anything. But on the topic of big ideas, I wonder if this growth on science denialism shouldn't also be a trend that you have to consider. I'm thinking in terms of Merchants of Doubt, that Conaway and Orestes book, in which you have actually a concerted organization of science denialism. And then in the last, I would say last 8 years, maybe 10, and of course, very much in evidence in the last 4 years, the growth of a denial for climate change, of the basic ideas of science. And is there going to be, these are big ideas, not in the same intellectual projects for the world, but they are very much in evidence, and they do have, it seems to me, an effect on the fabric of the society. So I wonder if these not have much impact. I wonder if this counter idea of science denialism is going to have some. Your book is probably one of the that I have read several times. I have read for those for that day in which for the AHA in 2000 when I review it. I have read it for my own dissertation. I have read it for my students. I have translated parts of it for my students, and it's always amazing. And yet, you knew there would be a yet. There's one thing that when I talk about modern environmental issues and society really comes up, it was as new technology. It's a question of internet and networks and so on. And the energy that now we need to have a more equitable planet. I mean, in other words, if you want to decrease in terms of social justice, you have to understand that everybody is going to need some level of energy to have also internet or so on. But also the question of circulation of ideas and trends and initiatives and so on. And it doesn't appear in any graph. I don't think that the internet and the power of internet may appear in any kind of graph, but at the same time, I do think it's something that has changed a lot in the last 20 years. And I wonder, is there any kind of impact in the way we think about nature, in the way we relate with nature? Because it seems to me a big trend. Another thing that, and it's my last point regarding your talk, I just forgot. So I'm going to let you answered, or José Augusto make some kind of comments, but if I remember that, I'm going to bring them back. Sorry. Zé? José Augusto?
Yeah. Thank you, John. Again, it's I'm still thinking about the amazing talk you gave to us. It's very interesting to see the author discussing an important book 20 years later, after the publishing of the book. And I also I read the book. I would not say many times, but more than one time I read most of the chapters. And but I also read the Great Acceleration, which is a kind of follow-up, another book you published. But I have a question. I think it's a big question about taking your point about China, because it was very interesting that you said that I would put more emphasis on China. And there are some signals, some discourses, and recently I had the opportunity of talking with the CEO of this big mining company, Vale. It's one of the major exporters of iron to China, and they have a lot of talks, inside talks with the Chinese authorities. And he said that Xi Jinping and the leaders there, they want to make a real green transition, you know. With their planning capacity, they could, this is what I'm saying now, if I'm asking indeed, if with their planning capacity, if they can make this transition with the new technologies also, and have quite a different impact in the 21st century than compared to the impact that the United States had on the 20th century, you know, on the environmental dimensions. If you believe, according to the trends, that they can lead at least a strong technological transition, technological green transition. And all the world is concerned about China, and everybody is discussing about it. And so this will be my main question for you now.
Okay, thank you, Gigi. Thank you, José Augusto. Let me try to answer these in the order in which they were asked. And Natasha, I will ask you to translate after every few sentences so that you don't have to remember too much at one time.
Okay.
So firstly, with respect to science denialism, Lizzie's first point, I think that's part of the explanation for the inertia that I see in so many trends, at least in some parts of the world, including the United States, including Russia. It might well be true in Brazil too, I don't really know. I think it's less true in other places, Japan, and probably much of Western Europe. I think ultimately, if I'm right, that the energy system is by far the most important variable, that science denialism is not going to have a great impact in the long run, because other things than ideas are going to shape the energy future.
Right. A primeira pergunta que ele está respondendo é sobre a questão do negacionismo científico. E ele está sendo otimista, dizendo que ele acredita que a longo prazo as ideias de negacionismo científicos não vão ter tanto impacto na história quanto a gente vê, porque porque a gente está assustado nesse momento que está acontecendo. A longo prazo, ele acha que outros fatores e a própria ciência vão se sobrepor a esse momento de negacionismo científico que a gente está vivendo. É bastante otimista, espero que seja verdade.
Okay.
Please go on, Professor.
Thanks, Natasha. So Lizzie's second question was about the internet as a technology that I didn't even mention. Well, she's right about that. I didn't even mention it. I regard the internet and the construction of the World Wide Web as the most important technology of the last 30 years, shaping the daily behavior of billions of people. So it's absolutely fundamental in that respect. And it has some good sides and some bad sides.
Sorry, I'm here. Yes. So the internet, a internet vai ser também uma ferramenta muito poderosa para formar essa história que a gente está vivendo do depois do século XX, do século XXI. E ele fala que realmente não falou no livro sobre isso, mas que hoje em dia a gente vê o quanto a tecnologia específica da internet muda a maneira como a gente está produzindo, produzindo conhecimento, também como a gente está interagindo com o mundo natural.
How to assess its importance in shaping environmental history is not obvious. My impression is that so far it has not had a decisive influence on environmental trends. So, for example, whereas once people expected that the digitization of information would reduce the global demand for paper, that if it has happened, it's happened on a minuscule scale. The internet and digitization has increased the speed with which information, including scientific information, circulates. But I don't see that as yet as having significant environmental impacts on the macro scale. It might in this locale or that locale. If I'm wrong, I would like to know about that, because that would be an important point I could make in a second edition of this book.
Então, ele está dizendo que, na verdade, a tecnologia da internet diretamente não influencia na questão dos... diretamente, ele não vê influenciando na questão do impacto ambiental. Que ele está comparando, por exemplo, que quando a gente achava que a digitalização do mundo e da informação ia reduzir a demanda por papel, tendo tanto volume de informação digitalizada, a gente continua apoiado numa tecnologia anterior. Então, ele vê isso com a internet também. Ele está dizendo que se ele estiver errado sobre essa posição dele, ele gostaria de saber que é um tópico para isso.
Okay, so the third question from José Augusto was about China. And I had said that China has become the most important country shaping global environmental history in the early 21st century, and that it might well have an effect as disruptive as the United States had in the 20th century. It is possible that China will lead the next energy transition. China invests more in renewables than any other country. It has more production capacity, I think this is true, for both solar and wind power, in terms of creating the solar panels and the wind turbines, more than any other country. And it will probably soon have more installed capacity, if it doesn't already, in terms of solar power and wind power. But at the same time, China is using more coal every year, and builds a coal-powered power plant for electricity generation every week. And it keeps the Australian coal mining business, well, until recently, they're having a quarrel with Australia now. But for 30 years, they kept the Australian coal mining business solvent. So their energy policy at present is all forms of energy. In the next 50 years, it's possible that China's impact would be to revolutionize the world's energy system and make it more sustainable and more ecologically benign. I desperately want someone to do it, and it's fine with me if it's China. I am not amongst those Americans who thinks that the United States has to be first in everything. I just want it to happen, and sooner rather than later. And if China does this, then China will have made an even more powerful imprint upon the environmental history of the 21st century by changing the energy system. Either way, if it doesn't change the energy system, or if it does, I think it's going to have the most important impact, simply because the Chinese economy will, in a few years, be the world's biggest economy. And its population is going to be increasingly prosperous and consume more and more. All these trends are unlikely to reverse themselves. So it is China where global environmental history, more than anywhere else, is being made and will be made, for better or for worse.
Certo. Sobre a influência da China nos últimos 20 anos do começo do século XXI, ele considera, como ele tinha dito antes, que ele não falou tanto sobre a China no livro, ele gostaria de ter falado mais, se ele fosse revendo algumas posições do livro, que a China no século XXI vai ter um papel mais ou menos equivalente aos Estados Unidos do século XX, em termos de capacidade de produção e de produção de energia, e em termos de capacidade industrial também. Mas ele considera que talvez possa ser a tendência a China liderar uma entrada de energias renováveis no mundo e realmente transformar e revolucionar o mercado de energias do mundo de uma forma positiva, que é realmente o país com mais capacidade de produzir e exportar e usar essa energia renovável. Isso pode ser uma tendência para os próximos 50 anos. Por outro lado, o que a gente vê hoje em dia é que a China ainda é atualmente o maior consumidor de carvão, que mantém quase exclusivamente mercados como o mercado de carvão da Austrália vivos, né? Então, é um consumidor imenso, um poluidor imenso. Então, mesmo que tenha essa capacidade de revolucionar a indústria da energia, pode ser que eles escolham um outro trajeto, que seja continuar com a exploração de energias fósseis, e que, de qualquer maneira, mudando o mercado ou seguindo na energia fóssil, a China, para o século XXI, vai ter uma marca tão grande, tão importante no mercado de energia, no consumo de energia mundial no século XXI, tanto quanto, talvez até mais importante que os Estados Unidos. Ele prefere pensar de forma otimista que a China vai liderar essa revolução energética e passar para uma matriz de energias renováveis, e que ele considera ele como norte-americano, como estadunidense, não acha que não precisa ser os Estados Unidos liderando essa revolução, que contanto que alguém faça, tudo bem, que seja a China, ele também está feliz com isso. Yes. Okay. So, do you have any other observations of Professor Padua and Lizzie? Because we have a list of questions from the audience. Can I go through them now? So you can
Go ahead.
Yes. Okay. Good. So I'm just going to read from the chat, right? I'm going to read you two questions, and then maybe you can talk about them. In text. Brooke Blair is one of our colleagues at the Labe, is asking, how can environmental history contribute for a critical reflection of human or our adaptation to global transformations in the future? And how can this reflection help with new relations with nature, with the natural world? So like historical thinking and historical considerations, how can they help us adapt to the future and maybe change our relationship with the natural world? Also considering, this is a second question from Bruno, also, how have you considered the changes in the mining industry in the face of the growth of production and consumption of electronic goods, so everything that uses mineral products, right? Cell phones, laptops, TVs. I think we've already touched on the idea of nature providing this technology, but if you could say something else about that. I think we can start with those two.
Okay, so the first one is one that environmental historians always think about. How can environmental history contribute to a useful reevaluation of the human relationship with nature? This is a basic motivation for a lot of environmental historians. I'll give you one example of how I think it can, and this is a thread that has run through my talk, and it runs through the book that I wrote. So in that book, I tried to understand why the 20th century had been so tumultuous, environmentally speaking. And my answer was, first and foremost, the energy system. If that historical analysis is correct, then the number one priority to try to stabilize the global environment and reduce the tumultuousness is to change the energy system. Now, if my analysis is wrong, my historical analysis, then the priorities should be elsewhere. So it is precisely in trying to understand the trajectory that brings us to the present that allows us to decide how to address the future. And sometimes the trajectory might be as short as 20 years. I think it's more often on the century or 2 century or 3 century scale that one needs to understand how the present was created in order to play a useful role in creating the future. So that's one example. And if I'm wrong about the centrality of the energy system, then I'm wrong about the priority for the 21st century. So these are important historical questions, as I see it. Second question was about mining. I didn't mention mining in my talk. I do mention it a lot in the book because I was impressed by the growth in the scale of mining over the 20th century and the degree to which large-scale industrial mining reached almost every corner of the world. Even obscure islands like New Caledonia in the Southwest Pacific were very heavily mined because it had a lot of nickel. It still does. So as I see it, this is another example of a trajectory remaining intact in the 21st century. The quantity of mining has continued to expand. The precise nature of which minerals are mined always changes. And there's some new ones that are involved in the production of electronics that didn't really matter 40 years ago, and they now do matter. As you're probably aware, there's the components that go into lithium batteries are particularly precious to mining companies now, and Bolivia is a very active zone in that respect. So there are changes in the composition of mining, but the general trend is as it has been since 1950. And I see that again and again across a number of variables. So to my mind, mining reinforces the arguments that I've made this afternoon or this evening in Brazil.
Right. Sobre a questão da reflexão histórica, o professor diz que essa é uma pergunta central da produção histórica de muitos historiadores ambientais, de como que a reflexão sobre o passado pode ajudar na crítica ao presente e nas nossas interações com o mundo natural no futuro. E ele diz que o exemplo maior que ele pode dar é sobre a questão da energia, que se a gente olhar historicamente como a mudança para uma matriz energética baseada em combustíveis fósseis afetou o mundo natural e as nossas relações com esse mundo natural, ao longo do século XX, a gente pode entender quais vão ser os problemas do século XXI. Então, você olha para essa matriz e vê os problemas que já foram causados e pode entender quais novas para que isso mude. A consideração é muito importante para muitos historiadores e historiadoras ambientais que falam dessas relações com um olhar não só histórico, mas também de conseguir influenciar questões presentes e futuras. Sobre a questão da mineração, ele diz que justamente reforça o estudo da mineração. Ele falou que não falou muito hoje sobre isso, mas que no livro ele fala muito, tem todo um capítulo, tem todo um pedaço do livro sobre isso. Acho que são 3 capítulos, né? Um pedaço assim, sobre a mineração, e que reforça essa ideia de que o estudo dessas tendências é importante para a gente ver como as coisas vão acontecer no futuro, que ele ficou muito impressionado na época da produção do livro, como que a mineração afetava rincões remotos ao redor do mundo, que tinha coisas na Nova Caledônia e mineração de produtos para a industrialização em lugares muito remotos e muito pouco industrializados. Então, é uma indústria que realmente toca o mundo inteiro. E ele diz que a composição dos minérios, por exemplo, o julgamento da exploração do lítio na Bolívia, a composição dos minérios ela vai mudando com o uso que eles têm das novas tecnologias, mas que o impacto da mineração em si, da retirada desses minérios na Terra, continua seguindo a tendência do século XX de ser crescente e de tocar todas as superfícies do planeta. Okay, so thank you so much, Professor, for your wonderful explanations about mining. I'm also very interested in the subject. I'm going to read now 2 questions which are also complementary. This is a question from Ana França, also a member of our laboratory in Rio, and a compliment from Pedro V, who told us he was joining us from Portugal. By the way, there are people from different parts of Brazil, Argentina, DC, Portugal, and I think there was another country. There's a very international audience today. So Anna asks, Mexico, yes, Mexico too. Anna asks, in the last 20 years, have you seen an increase in the number of protected areas and natural reserves in global terms? Can this be considered a counterpoint to this trend of exploration that you've presented? And complementing that, projects of rewilding a post-conservationist measure? And how can, I think this is a bit of an echoing of Bruno's questions, is how can environmental history contribute in the making of rewilding projects? So I think they're looking at this idea of all the trends that you presented are really happening, but at the same time, are there other trends of protection and conservation that you see on the rise globally?
Okay. So to Anna's questions, I will say, yes, I think there is an expansion in the total amount of protected area, especially when it comes to the oceans, where it's comparatively easy to declare a protected area and comparatively difficult to actually protect it, to enforce the regulations. So on paper, at least, there is an expansion, and it is a counter trend to the several trends that I've discussed so far. But bear in mind, first, that it's difficult to enforce these, and the will to enforce them is often weak. In the United States, for example, we have protected areas in places like Alaska, and the will to actually enforce those regulations has weakened in the last 4 years. So that's a qualification one has to bear in mind. And secondly, the places where protected areas are declared tend to be places that are not under much pressure from human activity. And so the actual preservation that happens compared to what would have happened otherwise is not so great. And places that really need to be protected, places where large amounts of forest are being burned every year, for example, these are much less likely to be included in the preserved areas. Rewilding. Environmental history can certainly contribute because rewilding, if it is to resemble a previous wild state, one has to know what that previous wild state was. There are at least two ways to attempt rewilding. One is just to leave an area alone and see what happens. The other is to try to rewild it so it resembles a particular point in the past when it was more wild than it is now. The first one, you don't need environmental history to do. The second one, you do need environmental history to do. And it is quite controversial as to which point in the past should one seek to reestablish. Should it be 500 years ago? 5,000 years ago? In either event, you need environmental history.
Right. These are very interesting points. So, vou traduzir, conversar aqui. Sobre a questão de áreas de conservação, há tendências de devastação. O professor diz o seguinte, que é verdade que tem muitas áreas sendo demarcadas e ele aponta especialmente para o crescimento de áreas demarcadas no oceano, que, na verdade, são os lugares mais simples de se demarcar, são menos problemáticos. Ele aponta dois problemas nessa trajetória de demarcações e de proteger áreas. O primeiro é que é muito mais fácil proteger no papel, né? Então, nem todas as áreas demarcadas como protegidas são necessariamente, de fato, protegidas. O segundo problema é que áreas que não são de fato protegidas e também falta alguma vontade política de proteção. Ele dá o exemplo do Alasca, que nos últimos 4 anos, mesmo tendo muitas áreas protegidas, a vontade política foi de diminuir esse tipo de proteção. Então, não significa que ela vai necessariamente, de agora em diante, para sempre, estar protegida. A segunda coisa é que essas áreas que, em geral, se estabelecem reservas e proteções são áreas que não estão em muito risco, que já são assim, áreas que já aparecem ser preservadas para manter o que está lá. Mas as áreas que precisavam ser protegidas no sentido de que já sofreram muito impacto, essas áreas muito raramente acabam sendo designadas como áreas protegidas. Sobre projetos de rewilding, eu não tenho uma tradução para rewilding em português. São projetos de... Lizzie?
Devolver a natureza. Devolver a natureza.
Devolver a natureza. Okay.
Isso acontece, por exemplo, no Brasil, quando você determina que uma área que foi cortada, que ela não pode ser tocada. Quando crescem os capoeirões os capoeirões na Mata Atlântica. Não é exatamente restauração, porque não necessariamente significa um investimento pessoal, simplesmente deixar a área ali e ela pode recuperar. Pode também significar investimento direto, enfim.
Isso.
Seria devolver a natureza, vai.
Devolver a natureza. Então, a gente não tem uma palavra específica, mas o rewilding, que seria resselvagizar, significa devolver a natureza. São duas maneiras, como a Liz estava falando agora, tem duas maneiras. A primeira, que seria só deixar rolar, não explorar mais aquela área e deixar ela acontecer novamente, ver o que acontece. E a segunda seria uma reconstrução de como aquela área era no passado. E que, nesse sentido, já respondendo a pergunta do Pedro, nesse sentido, claro que você precisa de história ambiental, porque se você vai reconstruir uma área natural do passado, você vai precisar dessa expertise, né? desse conhecimento. O que ele apontou também como problemático e controverso é em que ponto histórico a gente decide que a gente vai restaurar. A gente vai fazer com que aquela área seja parecida com o que ela era há 500 anos, há 1000 anos ou há 5.000 anos atrás. Então, são todas controvérsias desse tipo de projetos, mas que certamente a história ambiental contribui ou tem um papel a jogar nesse tipo de projeto de rewilding. Okay, so we have one final question. We are slightly over time, so we have one final question from the audience, which I think can be quickly answered, and it's something that I always want to know more about. Mariana Ribeiro. Mariana asks, in your opinion, what are the main differences and similarities between Anglo environmental history and Latin American environmental history, which is something that I know you and I have talked so much about. So I think this is a good closing question.
Okay, so Mariana, that is a question I often ask students on examinations. In fact, I expect that Natasha had to write an essay about that. So she is the real expert now, rather than I. But I'll say one thing that to me is a conspicuous difference, and it builds on something I said earlier about one of the trends in Anglophone scholarship towards a reduction in the political commitment of authors in environmental history. So I maintain that this is a trend in the Anglophone world. I think it is not in Latin America. I'm speaking about Latin Americans writing environmental history, not necessarily other people writing Latin American environmental history. But to the extent that I can follow what my colleagues in Brazil or Mexico or Colombia or Argentina are doing, I see that their commitments to environmentalism continue to motivate their scholarship. And I'm not saying this is a good thing or a bad thing. It's merely an observation. I think it's still true, but Natasha is now the real expert.
Thank you, Professor.
Natasha.
Lizzie, yes, go ahead.
I know that the audience had the last question, but I do want to use my prerogatives as coordinator of the lab and just ask one final question. John, going back to the gestation process of the book, you said that it was you're invited to write that, and you really start writing it in '96, therefore 25 years ago, more or less. And my question would be, you now wrote a book and you have been following the trends, but as we were writing it and doing the research for it, what surprised you? What did you discover while you're writing something new under the sun? What was something new under the sun for you as you were writing that book? Go back to the John McNeill of 25 years ago, please.
In some ways, I would love to go back to the John McNeill 25 years ago. I'll answer that in a couple of different ways. First of all, the research process for me was completely different from anything I had done before in ways that I was not prepared for and ways that surprised me. The earlier books that I had written had been based mainly on archival work. They were smaller in scope, and by the time I had begun to write them, I knew more about these subjects than anybody else on the face of the earth. And that gave me a certain confidence. When I started working on something new under the sun, I found that every day, even if I worked 12 hours, more relevant publications had appeared in those 12 hours, and I was further behind than in the morning. So every day I could work as hard as I possibly could, and I would still be further away from reading everything I should read to write this book. And that was a frightening realization. Global scale history is a very different kind of process. And I only began to understand that as I began to work on it. That's part of my answer. The other part of my answer is that I changed my mind fundamentally about the key driving force. You've heard me several times this evening speak about the energy system. When I began working on the book, I assumed that I was going to argue that population growth was the most important driving force. And I changed my mind about that. The more I learned, the less true that seemed. So there were also many really interesting smaller matters for me. I remember being fascinated by what was called the Transmigration Project in Indonesia and its environmental effects. There are 20 different things like that that were eye-opening for me when I was learning about them. But the biggest thing was changing my mind about the significance of population growth vis-a-vis the energy system. And then the biggest methodological thing for me was coming to grips with the fact that you cannot do global scale environmental history the way that I was trained to do history.
An incredible answer. Thank you so much for being so frank. Natasha?
Bem, a primeira, I agree with Lizzie. Before I start translating, this is it's always such a learning opportunity to, especially for us to go behind the scenes and see what it was like to be actually in the work of doing the book. Sobre a tradução, né? O que a pergunta foi quais são as maiores diferenças entre a história ambiental anglofônica e a nossa tradução aqui na América Latina. Eu me lembro de várias discussões em sala de aula onde a gente falava disso e a resposta do professor foi mais ou menos o que a gente já tinha, o que muitas vezes a gente conversou, que é a história ambiental anglo-saxã ou anglofônica se profissionalizou no sentido de que muitos historiadores e historiadoras não fazem mais um ativismo ambiental e que fazem mais uma história acadêmica. E ele vê que esse não é exatamente o caso aqui na América Latina, onde as questões políticas continuam sendo uma motivação muito forte para a produção acadêmica. Não houve essa desvinculação entre um ativismo, entre ser ambientalista e ser historiador, historiadora ambiental. Eu concordo com essa análise. Acho que a gente aqui na América Latina tem muito mais uma preocupação de influenciar políticas públicas e presentes e futuras do que talvez a história acadêmica dos Estados Unidos. A Lizzie fez uma outra pergunta sobre as surpresas durante a produção do livro. E ele apontou que as duas grandes surpresas que ele teve enquanto ele estava escrevendo o livro foi a primeira na maneira de organizar um livro de história global, que é muito diferente do nosso treinamento de historiadores e historiadoras, que a gente vai ao arquivo e lê todos os documentos, o maior número de documentos que a gente já sabe sobre aquele assunto específico, e você se torna um especialista realmente naquele assunto. Mas quando você está fazendo uma história em escala global e numa escala de século, ele falou assim, ele acordava, quando ele ia dormir, ele já estava assim, atrasado na produção de coisas que estavam acontecendo sobre tantos assuntos que ele tinha que ele gostaria de incluir no livro. Então, essa coisa de você não ser o expert em todos os assuntos foi uma surpresa, foi uma maneira diferente, metodologicamente, de como a gente é treinado para fazer a nossa história, que a gente encontra aquele assunto e vai contar aquela história que a gente sabe melhor que ninguém. No caso de contar a história do mundo todo durante um século, você não se torna especialista nessas coisas todas, né? E a segunda questão é que ele falou que quando ele começou a produzir o livro, ele pensava que a pressão demográfica, que o crescimento populacional ao longo do século seria o fator dominante ou o fator principal das mudanças ambientais que ele estava analisando, e que ao longo da pesquisa, ao longo da escrita do livro, ele percebeu que, na verdade, os sistemas de energia baseados em fósseis eram o fator mais relevante. Então, ele diz assim que ele mudou de ideia no meio do caminho. Isso é um aprendizado incrível para quem faz, para quem está ainda estudando no mestrado, no doutorado, que a gente sabe que, às vezes, a gente começa pensando uma coisa e se surpreende, e é difícil a gente mudar de ideia e desconstruir o que a gente já estava imaginando. Mas a gente vê como um livro, tanto publicado, pode mostrar que a gente realmente é possível mudar de ideia e é bom e saudável, né? Mudar de ideia. E sempre grandes lições. Eu quero agradecer a todo mundo que está aqui assistindo a gente. Passamos quase 2 horas conversando. E eu não sei se alguém tem palavras finais, mas... Então é isso. I just want to say thank you so much, Professor McNeill. I think Gabriel has some final words, but we're all super happy to have this conversation. It's been an amazing opportunity to revisit this book that is a landmark for our field and to hear you talk about it in ears. A great learning opportunity for all of us. Thank you. Gabriel?
Obrigado, Natasha. Nós temos muitos agradecimentos para fazer agora, né? Para você que nos auxiliou nessa mesa, para a Liz e para o Pada por todo o apoio, para o professor John McNeill, que esteve conosco agora, e para todos os coordenadores, todas as coordenadoras, todos os participantes que estiveram conosco nesses 2 dias de evento. Nós estávamos conversando agora e acho que alcançamos o nosso objetivo, né? Quando pensamos em organizar esse evento, que era nos conhecermos melhor, né? Nós, grupos e pesquisadores e pesquisadoras, de História Ambiental do Brasil, e criar pontes, né? E acho que conseguimos, né? E com o material que a gente vai organizar e disponibilizar depois, acho que esse objetivo também vai ser alcançado, vai facilitar para alcançar esse objetivo. Agora eu passo a palavra para os meus colegas da organização e para a Liz e para o Pada, claro, se quiserem fazer os comentários finais também.
Será que não é... Bom, Gabriel, será que não é melhor liberarmos o professor John McNeill? Né? Porque agora tem a ver com um evento, assim, né?
Sim. Natasha.
John. Natasha.
Acho que a Natasha congelou, Liz, por favor, pode assumir.
Tá bom. John, Gabriel is just thanking you a lot and all the others for your work here, and it was incredible. We learned a lot, and you're free. I mean, now we are going to do lots of things regarding the event itself, and you can just relax, good jacuzzi, lots of good stuff, and enjoy your books. And now you just have to write another 800-page book for us in 20 years to discuss it again.
Thank you so much for sharing your time with us, John, again.
John,
It's
amazing. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for giving me the chance to speak to you and listen to your questions. If I had only known when I was starting out as a historian how many interesting Brazilian environmental historians there were going to be, I would have studied Portuguese. That's another one of my regrets. Okay. Good night, all.
Take care.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Para o público, o John acabou de dizer que se ele soubesse quantas pessoas interessantes fazendo história ambiental no Brasil ele ia encontrar, ele teria aprendido português muito antes. E esse também é um dos seus arrependimentos, junto com aqueles outros. Ele é uma gracinha. Tá, então, volta aí, Gabriel. A palavra é tua.
Não, então, eu já fiz os agradecimentos e acho que alcançamos o que pretendíamos com essa primeira edição. Estamos animados para organizar as próximas. Agora a gente vai descansar uns dias, né? Mas depois a gente vai tocar as próximas, mas acho que meus colegas querem falar também. Né?
Paula.
Vou aproveitar, então, agradecer A todo o grupo do Labem, a professora Elisa, o professor Pado, toda a equipe mesmo que apoiou a gente o tempo todo, nas reuniões desse semestre não, né, desse ano todo virtual. E a gente também sempre discutindo o evento, todo mundo compartilhando com tudo. E também todo mundo que participou do evento, tanto hoje quanto ontem. E as palavras que escreveram no chat também deixam a gente com um acolhimento assim, muito grande. Muito obrigada. E também a todos os colegas da comissão organizadora, que foi muito bom isso. Para mim foi uma experiência incrível e eu estou muito grata a todos vocês.
Roda.
Eu estou até um pouco emocionada, porque quando pensamos essa ideia, não esperávamos que fosse dar tão certo. E essa era uma ideia que já existia desde 2019 e que depois fomos agregando outras pessoas, e veio a pandemia, e veio esse formato virtual que acabou dando super certo. Então, foi uma série de acontecimentos que desembocaram nesses 2 dias dessa semana, que foram muito especiais para o fortalecimento da nossa comunidade acadêmica, para o fortalecimento de laços entre os laboratórios, e mais do que isso, como um espaço para pessoas graduandos que estão chegando agora na universidade e querem saber o que é história ambiental, e eles vão poder se informar, e tenho certeza que esse era um dos objetivos que estava lá no nosso top list de ideias. E que bom, a partir dos comentários do YouTube, né, que ele foi alcançado. Agradecer aos professores, aos colegas da comissão, a todos os colegas do laboratório que deram muita força para a gente o tempo inteiro, aos outros laboratórios e a todo mundo que assistiu a gente. Muito obrigada, de verdade.
Obrigada, Ana. Bruno, você quer continuar? Bruno Araújo.
Sim, também queria reforçar esses agradecimentos, né, que já foram feitos, dizer que foi uma experiência muito rica para a gente, da comissão. Então, a gente ficou muito feliz. E pegando um pouco do gancho da Hannah, eu acho que quando a gente pensou o evento, começou a pensar um evento ano passado, em outro formato, a gente não tinha ideia do que a gente poderia alcançar, né? E a partir de algumas ideias que a gente teve durante esse ano, e eu acho que a Natasha Otoya também participou disso, que muito mais era a nossa expectativa de encontrar os colegas, né? De ter um evento que a gente pudesse encontrar os outros colegas de outros laboratórios, que a gente geralmente vê em outros eventos, e que a gente não estava podendo encontrar nesse ano, né? Devido ao isolamento. Então, acho que todos esses objetivos, desde o início, foram mais do que superados. Então, eu agradeço também.
Bruno. Natasha Barbosa.
Oi. O que a gente pode fazer hoje é agradecer muito, repetir isso várias vezes, todo o apoio que vocês deram para a gente, mesmo que esse encontro tenha sido assim, meio distante, mas ao mesmo tempo ele permitiu que a gente estivesse perto de outra maneira, a gente sentiu todo esse apoio, todo esse carinho, as manifestações de vocês. Então, o que fica, além de todos os diálogos maravilhosos, é a gratidão. Muito obrigada a todos vocês.
Quero fazer só mais uma coisa, que é muito obrigada também a Natasha Otoya, que fez essa ponte para essa palestra de encerramento. Foi maravilhosa e participando também. Muito obrigada, muita gratidão também.
Natasha, você não quer falar alguma coisa, Otoya?
Ai, gente, vocês são muito maravilhosos. Esse é o melhor grupo. Esse é o melhor grupo.
Não fala isso, que tem todos os outros laboratórios olhando para a gente agora.
Opa! Gente, a comunidade da história ambiental do Brasil é sensacional, fantástica e super unida. E eu tendo essa minha experiência fora de estudar com o professor McNeill lá nos Estados Unidos, vendo de fora, eu vejo isso ainda com mais clareza. A gente bomba muito. O Brasil bomba muito. O Brasil ama muito a história ambiental. Isso aí. Obrigada, galera. Obrigada a todo mundo que assistiu. Foi lindo.
Eu queria só que o Zé Augusto...
eu sou meio informal demais. Eu não posso estar a transmissão
de... Se preocupa com isso. Todo mundo tem direito a cerveja agora. Eu queria que o Zé Augusto terminasse, porque ele foi o fundador do Labem, e eu me pergunto se 25 anos atrás ele imaginava que aqueles encontros com os alunos de graduação ia dar um resultado desses. Então, Zé Augusto, se você quiser encerrar, eu acho que seria apropriado.
Pode ser, e muita alegria, assim, muita felicidade de ver. Eu gosto muito da autogestão, né? Da autogestão democrática, das pessoas tomarem as rédeas das suas vidas, né? Das suas ações. E é maravilhoso ver uma iniciativa dessa tão bem sucedida, e os professores tiveram pouquíssima participação realmente. A gente só deu algum conselho aqui, alguma ajuda ali, mas foram os participantes, né? Somente o pessoal, né, pós-graduando do laboratório que organizou tudo, e com muita eficiência e com muita tranquilidade também, né? Assim, eu achei muito bom ver isso, né? Não tinha grandes crises, estresse, as dificuldades eram mais ou menos manejadas com calma e com paciência. E foi muito legal. E foi uma coisa assim, uma ideia brilhante, viu? Foi uma ideia que saiu de vocês, uma ideia brilhante, porque mesmo quem está trabalhando com esse tema há muito tempo, eu não conhecia a maior parte desses laboratórios assim. Quer dizer, conhecia assim pessoas, né? Eventos, mas aquele quadro geral que aconteceu foi uma coisa nova. Eu nunca vi isso. Eu espero que dê frutos, né? Aumente o intercâmbio entre os laboratórios, a gente possa fazer mais trabalho juntos, e também saindo da pandemia, espero que vamos sair da pandemia, né? Esse ano, e que aí possa haver mais trocas pessoais também. E foi um grande avanço, eu acho, para a pesquisa em História Ambiental no Brasil. Foi um momento de avanço, um momento de crescimento. Foi muito bom. Fico muito grato mesmo, muito feliz. Estamos muito felizes.
Obrigada, Zé. E agora, antes que a gente chegue a 2h30 de encontro aqui, eu queria agradecer. Vamos sair do ao vivo e vamos tomar aquela cerveja, cada um na sua casa, tá? Para continuar essa. Um abraço para todos vocês e muito obrigada por todos que nos assistiram.